It was the kind of cold that seeps in early, before the first snowfall, when the mountains turn quiet and the forest seems to breathe on its own. Late October 2004, Senior Park Ranger Anthony Gulley, 38 years old, was finishing what would be his last patrol through the Upper Appalachian Ridge. He'd spent more than a decade keeping watch over these mountains, tracking illegal campsites, guiding lost hikers, and rescuing the occasional tourist who underestimated how fast darkness fell out here. By all accounts, it was supposed to be a routine evening. One final sweep before an incoming snowstorm closed the trails for the season. At 7:42 p.m., Anthony's voice came through the radio, steady and familiar. "Heading back down from Ridge 9, he said. "Everything's quiet tonight." Dispatch logged the call. Nothing unusual, but when the storm passed and daylight came, Anthony's truck was still parked at the edge of the fire road, engine off, driver's door slightly open, keys hanging from the ignition like he'd only stepped out for a moment. The seat was dry, which meant he hadn't been caught in the storm. His flashlight was lying in the mud a few feet away, still operational, and his folded field map had partially soaked through, the ink beginning to blur at the edges. It was as if time had stopped mid-shift. Search efforts began immediately. Rangers from 3 neighboring districts joined in, and local volunteers combed through dense brush and steep ravines for any trace of him. For the first 2 days, the dogs caught his scent moving uphill from the truck, consistent with his patrol route. But then, just as suddenly, the trail ended. The bloodhounds circled, confused, pacing around a patch of ground near a narrow deer path known as Whisper Hollow. The scent was gone. There was no sign of a fall, no drag marks, no blood, and no signs of a struggle. It was like the man had simply stopped existing in that exact spot. Investigators were careful not to feed rumors, but behind closed doors, the search teams were unsettled. Radios that worked fine at base would suddenly cut out once they neared Whisper Hollow. Compass needles spun. GPS units froze and rebooted without input. The area wasn't known for magnetic interference, but one ranger later admitted he'd never felt comfortable there, even before Anthony went missing. He said there was something off about the ridge, like the air felt heavier, as though sound didn't travel right. By the 3rd day, state authorities arrived. They swept the entire ridge with thermal imaging and brought in helicopters equipped with infrared sensors. Nothing. No heat signature, no footprints beyond where the trail ended. Investigators mapped every inch of terrain between the fire road and the hollow. The slope was steep but manageable, and there were no cliffs or creeks deep enough to conceal a body. The only notable feature was a half-collapsed animal den about 30 yards from the end of the trail. Inside, they found nothing but leaves and broken branches. No signs of struggle, no clothing fibers, no blood. Anthony's disappearance quickly became the park's top priority. For nearly 2 weeks, teams rotated through 12-hour shifts, using grid searches and aerial surveillance. They expanded the perimeter to over 20 square miles. But as days passed, the weather turned colder and morale dropped. The snow came earlier than expected, and soon most of Ridge 9 was buried under ice and debris. The official narrative shifted. The working theory was that Anthony likely slipped on the uneven terrain, fell into a crevice, or succumbed to exposure. It was the only explanation that made sense on paper, but off the record, no one truly believed that. Anthony was an experienced ranger, methodical to a fault. He carried backup gear, logged his routes religiously, and never deviated from standard protocol. More importantly, he was familiar with every ridge, every logging cut, every fire road for 50 miles. He didn't take unnecessary risks, especially not before a storm. His wife, Sarah Gulley, told investigators he'd been careful lately, more than usual. He'd mentioned that the forest felt wrong lately, that he'd been hearing radio feedback in places that shouldn't have had coverage. She brushed it off as static from old equipment. By November, the search was scaled back. The Park Service issued a formal statement calling Anthony Gulley's disappearance an unfortunate and unresolved tragedy. They never recovered his body, his weapon, or his secondary radio. His badge, wallet, and logbook were missing too. The file was marked open, but inactive. Local papers ran the story for a week before it was replaced by the next storm report. But within the small towns surrounding the Appalachian Park boundary, Anthony's case turned into something darker. campers began talking about strange radio interference on cold nights, how they'd pick up what sounded like a ranger's voice calling out numbers or coordinates that didn't match any map. Hunters swore they heard someone moving just out of sight, then silence. The legend of Whisper Hollow grew fast. Locals said there was a pull in those woods, something that made animals go quiet and people lose their bearings. A few even claimed that if you stood still long enough, you could hear your own voice echo back from somewhere deeper in the trees, just a half-second late, as if something was repeating you. The Park Service dismissed these stories publicly, but among rangers, Whisper Hollow became a name spoken carefully. Radios would cut out mid-transmission in that area, even years later. And equipment logs quietly noted magnetic instability near Ridge 9. For Sarah Gulley, the hardest part wasn't the unanswered questions. It was the silence. Every night, she'd sit by Anthony's old base radio in their cabin, listening to static. Sometimes she swore she heard faint breathing through the interference. Other times, a low hum that felt like words she couldn't quite make out. By winter's end, the case of Anthony Gulley had become part of the mountain's long memory. One more name among the hundreds who vanished without a trace in the Appalachian wilderness. But those who had searched for him never forgot how his voice sounded over the radio that night. Calm, certain. "I'm heading back down from Ridge 9. Everything's quiet tonight." It was the kind of transmission that sounded ordinary, until you realized it was the last anyone would ever hear from him. And for 15 long years, the mountains kept their silence, until one cold November night, when Anthony Gulley's voice came back through the static one final time. Winter came and went, but the mountains held on to their silence. Months passed before the Park Service returned to Ridge 9, and by then, the snowmelt had erased nearly every trace of what happened. What hadn't faded, though, was the unease that hung over the case. The disappearance of Ranger Anthony Gulley had become something unspoken inside the Appalachian Park Service. One of those things rangers didn't talk about but always thought about when they signed out for solo patrol. In early spring, Anthony's personal cabin was emptied. Standard procedure, they said. The park boxed his uniforms, gear, and photos for storage. But his wife, Sarah Gulley, refused to leave the property. For her, the cabin wasn't just their home, it was the last place that still felt like him. She told investigators that Anthony hadn't been himself in the weeks before he vanished. He was distracted, sometimes awake late at night, taking notes by lamplight and muttering to himself as he flipped through topographical maps. When she asked what he was working on, he said it was just trail maintenance reports. But she noticed something odd. He'd started keeping 2 notebooks, the official one, which always went to base at the end of each shift, and another, smaller one, bound in dark canvas that he never let out of his sight. That second notebook was never found. When detectives re-examined the case files, small inconsistencies began to appear. Anthony had logged several solo patrols in restricted zones without requesting clearance, specifically in and around Ridge 9. He had also pulled archived reports of missing hikers from as far back as 1997, printing out pages from the park's old incident system long after those cases were considered closed. No one had realized it at the time, but 5 disappearances, all within a 6-year period, occurred within the same 5-mile radius where Anthony vanished. The missing hikers shared no common link, different ages, backgrounds, even seasons. But each case ended the same way: lost trail, failed scent, and 0 evidence of foul play. The files had been dismissed as the same sad story, people underestimating the wilderness. Yet, colleagues recalled Anthony speaking differently about them. He said they weren't random. He mentioned unmapped tunnels, strange hollows that didn't appear on any geological survey, and a sound beneath the ridge that he couldn't explain. At first, the other rangers thought he was joking, but his tone changed over time. One ranger, Donnie Hale, told investigators that Anthony once returned from Ridge 9 looking pale and disoriented. He said he'd heard something underground, like wind moving through rock, but the air outside was perfectly still. He never elaborated. When the search team went back that spring to check the ridge again, conditions were worse. Melting snow had turned the trails into mud, and fallen trees from the storm still blocked most paths. They focused on the area where Anthony's scent had last been tracked, near Whisper Hollow. A few hundred yards from that spot, under a tangle of downed branches, they found something small but undeniable: a torn fragment of uniform cloth, still bearing the frayed edge of a ranger's shoulder patch. DNA testing later confirmed it belonged to Anthony. Not enough for a clear match, but consistent with his uniform type and the fiber weave used by the Park Service at the time. Alongside it, investigators found a piece of old rope tangled around a root, the kind used in older rappelling gear. It was brittle, almost fused into the mud, but tests showed it had likely been there for more than a decade. The discovery reignited the case for a brief moment, but it didn't last. There was still no body, no weapon, and no sign of a struggle. The area didn't fit the terrain for a fall, and there was no cliff or shaft nearby that could have hidden him. Every possible explanation collapsed under its own logic. Without evidence of foul play, the Park Service had no choice but to classify it as environmental exposure, a technical term meaning the mountain took him, one way or another. Sarah never accepted that. She believed her husband had found something out there, something he wasn't supposed to find. She remembered how he'd grown quiet before he vanished, sometimes staring into the trees, as if he was listening for something no one else could hear. In his last week at home, he barely slept. He'd spend hours out back by the tree line, radio on low volume, jotting down coordinates in that missing notebook. When she asked him if he was all right, he said, "There's something under this ridge. You can feel it if you stand still long enough." She thought it was a figure of speech. Now, she wasn't so sure. Within the ranger community, whispers began to spread. Stories of radio interference near Ridge 9, equipment failure, faint voices picked up on static. None of it could be proven, and most dismissed it as the kind of superstition that grows in empty places. But one park employee, reviewing the radio logs months later, noticed something buried in the system. In the week before Anthony's disappearance, his call sign appeared on the log twice, once for his standard check-in and a second 3 minutes later, at a time when the system showed no transmission received. It looked like a duplicate record, or maybe something else had repeated his last message. By the end of summer, the case was dormant again. The files were sealed, tagged with the same administrative label used for countless other missing persons in the mountains. But among locals, a different phrase took hold. "The ridge took him," they said. For Sarah, those words were unbearable. It sounded like folklore, but it also felt true in a way the official report never did. Something had taken her husband, and in the silence that followed, in the long, quiet nights where the only sound was static from the old park radio she refused to unplug, she started to believe it might not be over. Because sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, when the wind cut just right across the valley, the radio would hiss once, just once, and she swore she could hear a man's voice saying her name. And then, nothing but static. 15 years passed before anyone heard the name Anthony Gulley spoken in the park office again. By then, his case was a line item buried in a forgotten archive folder, one of dozens of disappearances the Appalachian Service had never solved. Rangers came and went, radio systems were upgraded, towers replaced, the wilderness had moved on, or so everyone thought. In November 2019, the park's main communication network registered a signal at 11:17 p.m., a faint analog transmission that shouldn't have existed. The night dispatcher, an older technician named Ralph Monroe, saw the call sign flicker across the monitor. He didn't recognize it at first, but the code looked familiar. When he checked the ID registry, his stomach tightened. It was Ranger Anthony Gulley's identifier. Inactive since 2004. The audio that followed was mostly static, a dry, uneven hiss that wavered in and out. Then buried beneath the distortion, a man's voice, clear enough to raise the hairs on Ralph's neck, cut through the noise. "Base, do you copy? I'm still on Ridge 9. Ralph froze. The voice sounded human, steady, calm. The timestamp on the log showed the signal came from Repeater Tower 4, a station that had been offline for more than a decade. Thinking it was some kind of technical glitch, he saved the file and called the night supervisor. But when they replayed the recording, a second anomaly appeared. The embedded metadata listed the original broadcast time as October 29th, 2004, 7:46 p.m., the precise minute Anthony's final patrol had ended. The Park Service immediately ran diagnostics. The repeater tower had no active power supply and no radio hardware capable of transmitting. They chalked it up to a corrupted playback file, a random data echo left in the system from an old log migration. But Ralph didn't buy it. He'd been working communications for 20 years. No data file resurrects itself in real time. 2 nights later, confirmation came from outside the park. A private radio hobbyist in Kentucky, nearly 40 miles away, posted a message on an amateur network forum claiming he'd picked up a strange, repeating ranger frequency on the 155 MHz band. He attached a short clip. The voice matched Anthony Gulley's, word for word. The recording ended with a sharp spike of static and one final word that none of the official logs contained: cold. When the park learned of the external recording, the situation shifted from technical error to internal panic. Every ranger who'd ever searched Ridge 9 remembered the case, even if they'd tried to forget it. The park's public information officer issued a brief statement to local news. The signal, they said, was a replay artifact from archived transmissions. But off the record, technicians were told to review every repeater tower in the district. None showed signs of power restoration. The story spread quickly through online forums dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Former rangers who had worked with Anthony reached out to his family, unsure what to believe. For Sarah Gulley, who'd spent 15 years learning to live in the silence her husband left behind, the call felt like a wound reopening. She refused interviews, but allowed investigators to listen to the original transmission inside her home. When the static gave way to Anthony's voice, she covered her mouth and turned away. It was him. Same tone, same rhythm, same calm under pressure that she remembered from every storm season. Experts were brought in to analyze the recording. Audio specialists from the National Telecommunications Laboratory confirmed the voice frequency range was consistent with a live human transmission, not a digital replay. But the timestamp embedded in the signal created a paradox. A modern digital system had received a packet stamped 15 years in the past. They couldn't explain how. Within days, the forest was alive with rumors again. Hikers claimed their handheld radios picked up bursts of static near the closed access road to Ridge 9. A maintenance worker reported hearing an old call sign flash on his scanner while driving through the valley. The park closed that section for technical upgrades, though no new equipment was installed. For the Gulley family, the quiet they had fought so hard to preserve was gone overnight. Sarah's son, Luke, now 27 and volunteering as a ranger himself, became obsessed with the signal. He convinced himself that his father might still be out there, injured, trapped, or somehow trying to reach home. Sarah begged him to let it rest, but Luke couldn't. He tracked the signal data, studied tower maps, and filed a request to join the next scheduled equipment inspection on Ridge 9. Investigators reopened the case file temporarily, mostly to placate public curiosity, but even the new officers admitted the evidence was strange. The repeater tower that supposedly carried the signal had been dismantled in 2008, its hardware long removed. Yet somehow, a full 15 years after Anthony Gulley vanished, his call sign had broadcast through that same frequency, at the same coordinates where he'd last been heard alive. The park's final statement called it a coincidence, a fragment of corrupted analog data that coincidentally resembled a missing ranger's voice. Officially, the matter was closed. But inside the ranger base, no one stopped talking about it. One technician claimed that when he filtered the noise floor from the recording, he heard more than just Anthony's words. In the last 2 seconds, layered under the static, there was another voice, whisper low, repeating the word cold right after him. The file was sealed again. But that whisper never really left those who heard it. For Sarah and Luke, it meant only one thing: the mountain hadn't finished its story. And 15 years after the disappearance, Ridge 9 was calling someone back. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. And if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. By early spring of 2020, the case of Anthony Gulley had become more than a mystery. It was an obsession, especially for his son, Luke. He'd grown up surrounded by the silence of his father's disappearance, by unanswered questions, by the endless static that seemed to haunt his mother's nights. Now, 27, Luke had joined the Park Service as a volunteer ranger, working the same territory his father once patrolled. He said he wanted to honor him. But everyone who knew Luke understood the truth. He wasn't looking to serve the park. He was looking for him. When the strange radio signal re-emerged months earlier, Luke couldn't let it go. He read every page of the original report, visited the archive where his father's uniform had been boxed up, and tracked the coordinates of the repeater tower where the signal supposedly came from. Everything pointed back to one place, Ridge 9. It was the same ridge the park had sealed off years ago after multiple landslides and 2 unexplained disappearances. Officially, no one was allowed there. Unofficially, Luke didn't care. He managed to convince 2 senior rangers and a forensic technician to join him on what they called a limited survey. Their mission was to assess the stability of the ridge for potential re-entry. But everyone knew what Luke was really there for. The night before the hike, one of the older rangers pulled him aside and said quietly, "If you go up there looking for ghosts, you're bound to find something you can't bring back." Luke didn't respond. He just looked out at the dark outline of the ridge and said, that's where his voice came from. The morning of the expedition, the forest was thick with fog. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't moved in years. As they ascended, small things began to go wrong. The compasses drifted and spun in slow circles. GPS units flickered on and off. Batteries drained faster than they should have. The group joked about it at first, blaming interference from old mining equipment buried under the ridge. But by the 3rd hour, no one was laughing. The higher they climbed, the quieter everything became. Birds stopped calling. Even the wind died down, replaced by an unnerving stillness that pressed in on all sides. They reached the first checkpoint, an overgrown fire road half swallowed by brush, and stopped to rest. That's when the radios began to distort. At first it was just faint static, then an echo. When one of the rangers spoke, the words came back through the speaker a second later, slightly warped, as if someone else were repeating them. The forensic tech checked the frequency, but found no secondary transmission. The signal was bouncing from somewhere nearby. They switched channels, but the delay followed. That night, the team made camp just below the ridgeline. They set up their tents near a cluster of dead pines, marking their position on the map by memory, since all GPS devices had failed completely. The air was colder there, almost metallic. Luke sat alone by the dying fire, listening to the forest breathe. Around midnight, he picked up his handheld radio and pressed the transmit button, whispering, "Base, do you copy?" Static. Then, faintly, a reply, low, distorted, and human. "Stay where you are. Don't follow the light." He froze. The voice was quiet, but unmistakable. It was his father's, the same tone he'd heard on old family recordings, the same calm authority that once filled his childhood home. For a moment, Luke thought he'd imagined it, but when he replayed the audio, the message was still there. He woke the others, but when they checked their own radios, the frequency was dead. No one slept after that. They sat in uneasy silence until dawn, the mist curling through the trees like smoke. At first light, Luke began scanning the area around camp. About 50 yards from where they had slept, the ground sloped down toward a narrow clearing. That's where he saw them. Boot prints, faint but fresh, embedded in the soft mud. The tread pattern was old-fashioned, the kind issued to park rangers in the early 2000s. None of the current team wore that type. The prints led away from the campsite, toward a dense patch of undergrowth near the base of the ridge. They followed in silence, hearts pounding, until the path ended abruptly at a collapsed slope of dirt and stone. Hidden beneath the debris was the dark outline of a tunnel opening, just wide enough for a man to crawl through. The edges were raw, freshly disturbed, like something had shifted recently from underneath. The forensic tech examined the entrance and noted there was no record of any mine or service tunnel in this area. It wasn't on any park survey. Luke knelt at the edge of the opening, brushing away the loose soil with his glove. The air that drifted out was unnaturally cold, and beneath it came a faint hum, almost mechanical, like feedback from a distant signal. He whispered his father's name once, but the sound of it disappeared into the dark. The rangers debated whether to enter, but the ground was unstable. One wrong step could cause a collapse. They decided to mark the coordinates and return with a proper excavation team. As they turned to leave, Luke lingered, staring into the blackness of the tunnel, certain that somewhere beyond the wall of rock, his father's voice was waiting. That night, back at base, Luke replayed his radio recording over and over again. Each time, the distortion grew worse, but one detail stayed the same, the faint echo that came right after the voice said, "Don't follow the light." It wasn't a repeat of the phrase. It was a response, a whisper, barely audible. But when he slowed it down, he swore he could hear his own voice answering back. He didn't tell the others, but deep down, Luke knew what it meant. The mountain wasn't done with the Gulley family yet, and whatever was beneath Ridge 9 had just opened its mouth for the first time in 15 years. When the excavation team finally returned to Ridge 9, the air carried that same bitter stillness that had haunted it for years. The trees seemed older here, bent, quiet, holding their breath. Luke Gulley stood at the edge of the collapsed slope, the same place they'd found the boot prints days earlier. He hadn't slept since. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that voice repeating through static, "Don't follow the light." The park approved a limited descent under the guise of geological survey work, though everyone involved knew what they were really there for. Luke went in first, followed by Ranger Tom McAdams, a 20-year veteran, and Mara Fields, a forensic technician. They were equipped with air sensors, body cams, and a live radio link to base. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough to crawl through, the earth pressing close on either side. As soon as they passed into darkness, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath fogged the lenses of their visors, and a faint metallic scent filled the air. Old water, coal dust, and something else. The walls bore signs of human work. Wooden struts, long rotted through, lined the entryway, and the faint glint of rusted tools jutted from the dirt. Someone had been here before, decades ago, maybe longer. The group's headlamps revealed iron hooks nailed into the rock, likely used for lanterns. The deeper they went, the colder it got. Moisture dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, echoing like slow, deliberate footsteps that never got closer. Roughly 100 feet in, Luke's flashlight caught something snagged in a crack between the rocks. He knelt down and pulled gently. A torn scrap of khaki fabric, frayed and darkened by time. The letters were faint, but still visible. "Gulley." Mara's voice trembled as she read the patch aloud. The room went silent. They bagged the fabric for testing, but Luke's hands shook as he sealed it. Just beyond where he found the cloth, a dull reflection caught his light. Embedded in the mud was an old handheld radio, its casing rusted and half buried. The coiled lanyard that once tethered it had snapped clean in half. The serial number, when cross-checked with Anthony's equipment record, was a match. Luke stared at it for a long time before speaking. "He dropped this on his way out," he said quietly. But the way the radio was positioned, face down, perfectly centered in the narrow passage, made it look less like something that had been dropped, and more like something that had been placed. Farther ahead, the tunnel widened into a circular chamber carved from smooth rock. The transition was abrupt. Natural stone gave way to a surface too even to have formed on its own. The air grew heavier inside, dense enough that their voices sounded muffled, as if swallowed by the walls. Mara checked the audio sensors, frowning. There was a constant low-frequency hum running beneath everything, a rhythmic vibration that pulsed every few seconds, steady as a heartbeat. Tom adjusted his radio to record ambient sound levels. The moment he did, the hum shifted. It became slower, deeper, as though reacting to them. The team exchanged nervous glances. Luke called for backup through his handheld, but what came through wasn't his own voice. The transmission crackled, and then, layered under the static, a calm male voice responded. "Luke, you shouldn't be here." It was unmistakable. His father's tone, measured, composed, but distant, like it was coming from somewhere far below the earth. Luke froze. He tried again, repeating his call sign. The reply came again, distorted this time, repeating his exact words back at him with a half-second delay. Mara backed up, whispering that it could be signal feedback, but she sounded like she didn't believe it. Tom scanned the chamber with his flashlight, and for a brief second, they all heard it, a faint scrape of movement just beyond the beam's reach. No one spoke. Luke took a hesitant step toward the far wall, but the moment his boot hit the ground, the hum in the air grew louder. Every piece of equipment they carried began to malfunction. The radio hissed, the camera feed fractured, and Mara's EM sensor spiked into the red before shutting off completely. That was enough. Tom ordered a retreat. They backed out one by one, Luke staying last, still holding the radio in his hand like it might say something else. When they finally emerged into daylight, none of them said much. The air outside felt wrong, warmer than it should have been, yet thin, almost like the mountain was exhaling. They set up camp a few hundred yards from the entrance, exhausted and shaken. Luke spent the evening studying the recovered items, tracing his fingers over the fabric with his father's name stitched into it. Around midnight, the camp grew restless. Tom McAdams, unable to sleep, took his flashlight and walked a short distance away toward the ridge. Mara remembered hearing his boots crunch against the frost, then silence. 10 minutes later, Luke looked up from his notes and realized Tom hadn't come back. They called his name, scanned the tree line, and got no response. At 12:43 a.m., Luke found the flashlight. It was half buried in loose soil, still on. The beam angled upward toward the ridge's black silhouette. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of where Tom had gone. By dawn, the search for him began. But the effort was brief. The ground had shifted overnight. A fresh crack had opened where the slope had been stable the day before. The entrance to the tunnel was now gone, swallowed by debris. Luke stood there in silence as the others debated what to do next. He stared at the ridge, his father's radio hanging from his hand, still covered in rust and dirt. He switched it on one last time, not expecting a response. Static filled the channel, then cleared for a heartbeat. A man's voice, faint but familiar, whispered through the speaker. "Go home." It was the same message he'd heard before, the same voice that had warned him not to follow the light. Luke didn't answer. He just looked back at the ridge, realizing that now, like his father, one more name would be added to the list of people who went up there and never truly came back. Weeks passed before anything else surfaced. The Park Service filed their reports. The investigation into the disappearance of Ranger Tom McAdams stalled, and the entrance to the mine had been declared unsafe. Ridge 9 was quiet again. For most people, that was the end of it. But not for Luke Gulley. He'd returned home, hollow-eyed and restless, spending long nights replaying the last recordings from his father's recovered radio. He told himself it was for closure, but deep down, he wasn't sure what he was searching for. Proof that his father was gone, or proof that he wasn't. Then one morning, just after dawn, Luke found a plain brown envelope wedged beneath his cabin door. No stamp, no sender. Just a single item inside. A small SD card labeled R9 in black marker. At first, he thought it was from the Park Service, maybe data recovered from the field, but when he plugged it into his laptop, the files were different. Fragmented, corrupted. Each one was only a few seconds long. Audio bursts riddled with static and time codes stretching back 15 years. Then he reached the final clip. The file opened to the sound of heavy breathing, boots scraping over stone, and a faint metallic hum in the background, the same sound they'd heard deep in the mine. The voice that followed was unmistakable. It was Anthony Gulley. His tone was calm, but strained, like someone whispering while trying not to be heard. "Something's moving below," he said softly. "If anyone finds this, tell Sarah I heard them calling me from under the ridge." The audio ended there, abruptly, like the recording had been cut off mid-breath. Luke played it again, then again, each time lowering the volume as if that would change what he heard. But it never did. The sound beneath his father's voice, the faint pulse, was there too, steady and rhythmic. It wasn't wind, it wasn't water. It was something moving. A week later, seismic sensors placed along the Appalachian Ridge began picking up strange patterns. The data showed short bursts of rhythmic vibration, roughly in 10-second intervals, consistent with human pacing. The readings came from deep below Ridge 9, well beneath where the tunnels had ever been mapped. A small ranger team was dispatched to check for landslides or ground instability. What they found instead was an eerie silence. No movement, no damage, no sound at all. Then, as they began packing up their gear, every radio on the channel erupted at once with a burst of static. For 3 seconds, all signals synced, broadcasting a single voice that froze them in place. "Luke, go home." It was Anthony Gulley, clear, undeniable, and then, just as suddenly, silence. The broadcast was logged by the park's monitoring system at 7:46 p.m., the same time Anthony's final transmission had ended 15 years earlier. After that, the National Park Service sealed Ridge 9 completely. The area was declared permanently restricted due to unstable terrain and seismic irregularities. Officially, the report closed the Gulley file once and for all. The last page listed Anthony Gulley, presumed deceased, 2004. But among the rangers, no one believed it was over. In quiet moments, especially during night patrols, some claimed to hear static on the low channels, soft at first, then rising, like a voice struggling through interference. It always began the same way: a faint click, then a single, familiar line. "Base, do you copy?" When that happens, no one responds, not anymore. They just turn the volume down and wait for it to fade, because everyone who's worked those mountains long enough knows one thing about Ridge 9. Once a voice answers from below, it never really stops calling back.